Hi guys! Today I want to show you some tips for painting dragons with watercolor. This is a dragon watercolor painting I did recently for a short story. The short story is called Princess and Dragon, and you can download it for free online. And I painted this dragon with watercolor, and I'm just going to show you some of the tips, watercolor tips and tips for painting dragons, getting some texture and different things like that. So here we go. So first of all, I have just this like blank piece of watercolor paper. I'm going to show you some things. If you've never used watercolor before or found it frustrating, here's some tips that will help with that. So first thing is, when you're painting with watercolor, if you paint right onto a dry paper, which is what this is, then you'll get your paint will stay like right where you want it to stay. It doesn't bleed or go anywhere like that. But as soon as you add water to it, it's gonna bleed out where the water is. So I know that's a little shiny, you might not be able to see it very good, but as it dries you'll be able to see. So we're gonna let that do its thing for a minute. And then you can also paint right into wet. So here I'm just painting water on my paper, and then if I take my paint and paint into that, you can see that it starts to bleed out right away. The edges are fuzzy. The more water that you have, the more it's going to bleed. So if we get a lot more, so it's kind of puddling up on there, it's just a lot more bleedy, it just runs right into that water. So you can also see that the paint doesn't go outside of the water. It's not going to bleed past the edge where you got it wet. So when you're trying to control watercolor paint, if you don't want it to bleed past something, then make sure not to get that part wet. So there you have like 3 different ways of controlling your watercolor. I know that's still really wet and shiny, you can't see, but if you look over here you can see how it sort of bled around the edges. So this is still even a little bit wet, so even if I say I was painting something else and this new color object that's next to it, and I started doing it while this is still a little wet, so I'm here painting on my dry paper, and then as soon as I get in right here, it's going to start to bleed into this wet area and cause problems for you. So you want to wait in between doing your different objects if you want it to be a hard edge. If you want it to bleed into each other, which sometimes you do, then go ahead and, you know, paint right into that wet, and you'll get some other cool effects with it. So it looks like this isn't bleeding too much. It must be drier than I thought. But that's partly how you control watercolor. So now I'm going to give you some tips about salt. I'll set this aside, and maybe as it dries I'll show you again how it works. Okay, so here's my new piece of watercolor paper. I'm just going to show you some tips for using salt to make textures, which can be really fun when you're painting a painting, depending on what you're painting. But for dragons, it would be the painting of the scales. So if you take your paint, I'm going to take some ultramarine blue paint, and I'm going to paint on my picture. I'm going to do it wet and wet. So get it wet, and we'll paint our blue. Get more color than that. It's all wet and drippy. And then I'm also going to do an alizarin crimson right here. I got this all wet. Grab my alizarin crimson paint. Paint that. You can see how that spread right out into the water. the different colors have different properties. They act differently. So you just have to experiment and see how they go. And that's why I'm going to show you this with the salt. So now I'm going to put the salt on while it's still wet. You just sprinkle it on. And now you have to let it dry. And as it dries, it'll create cool effects. So I'm going to dry this and then come back and show you what we've got. Alright, so here we have these two paint colors that are dry now. You can see the salt is still on there. So I'm just going to take my finger, and again it's like really dry. I'm going to rub that off. If you do this before it's totally dry, you're going to mess up your paper and your paint. So make sure to get it all the way dry. So there you have the basically finished product. As you can see, the salt made a cool texture on both of the colors, but the colors didn't act the same. Like this blue one has a lot more, they're kind of bigger splotches, and the red one is a little bit more confined. It still made a neat little texture, but it didn't quite spread about as much as this. So the different colors are going to act different, so just experiment and see what you're going to get. And then we have this other one that I showed you earlier. Now that it's dry, you can see how the paint blended together in the wet area and how that worked out. So, okay, so now using some of these tips, we're going to go ahead and paint our dragon. So I have this drawing already finished and ready to go. Hopefully you can see it pretty well. So the first thing we're going to do before we start painting is make sure we know where our light source is coming from. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and put the light source coming from over here. So that's important because with watercolor you need to know where the light is so you can save that and bring it out and get the right values. Without the right values, you can't see what you're doing. So, okay. So now, with our dragon, I'm going to get him wet because I want his stomach to be kind of like a lighty peach, and we'll go ahead and do him sort of purplish blue on the back. But I want it to blend really well together, kind of like we did with this right here. So I'm going to get him wet except for the spot that we want to save white. So the places where I don't want the paint to go, I'm going to leave white, and the rest of it I'm going to put water over. Okay, so there's our little dragon. He's all wet. Do some of this at the beginning, make sure it's good and wet. I didn't get wet any of the spots along where I want the light to be shining. Now I'm going to take my paint. We're going to do purple on the back side of him. And go along, and it's going to run around because the paper is wet. And it's also going to run down because I have it on a slant. And then on the other side, I'm going to do kind of a reddish orange color where his stomach scales are. And I'm just going to go ahead and let those blend together along this line right here. Now I'm going to take just water and I'm going to paint this part that we didn't get wet at the beginning. because I don't want it to be completely white. And I don't want a hard edge right there. Okay, so that's our first layer. And then since it's a dragon and I want texture, I'm going to go ahead and put salt on it. And now I'm going to let that dry before we move on to the next layer. Okay, that's pretty dry now. As you can see, the salt is making some really cool textures on here that we'll incorporate and use for the dragon's scales in a minute. Now we're going to go ahead and do the wings, and I'm going to use a similar technique on the wings that we did with his body, and use the same color. So I'm just going to take my water and I'm going to get this whole wing wet. And then once it's nice and wet like that, I'm going to get my purple paint that I used for his body, and I'm going to do that at the top. Saving again this edge where the light is coming from. Then we're going to take the orange color and do that toward the bottom of the wings. Bring that up into here a little bit so it blends. You can see it's dripping right down. And I want the edges of the wings to look a little ragged. So now I'm going to take my squirt bottle, this little teeny thing, and I'm going to have my paper towel to protect my thing. I'm taking my squirt bottle and I'm just going to spray that and let it drip off the page. So you can see it's running right down, and it's the wetter I get it, the more it runs. And I'm just going to let that drip right down. Looks kind of like rain. And you can see over here where I didn't get it wet, nothing is really happening. Even if the water sprayed over here, that paint is dry. It's not moving. So there's one. I'm going to let that dry and do this other edge right over here the same way. Hold it up, give it a little spray. It even bled out right here because I sprayed it. If I hadn't sprayed that, it would have stayed. But I'm going to let it do that because I like that look. Okay, so now we have that. We're going to let that dry, and then we'll do some new steps. Alright, so these wings are all dry now. You can touch them. You can see it made a pretty cool wash where it gradually changed to a different color. If you wanted more pigment in there, just add more pigment as you go, and you'll still get quite the nice wash with that technique. So now I'm just going to take the salt off of this guy. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start on the face a little bit, and I'm going to do the eye first. Give him a little bit of personality. Well, part of the eye, because we'll have to do it in pieces. I'm just going to paint that pupil really dark, leaving a highlight. This is just painting with my paint right onto dry paper. And then again over here. I'm going to leave that like that and let that dry before I add some shadows and things to the eyes. With his face, we're going to put some shadows in so that it has more of a roundness and dimension to him. So I have my same purple, but I've mixed a little bit of a darker blue in with it. And I'm just going to paint right over the watercolor salt splotches that we have. It'll show through in the end without being overbearing. I'm going to leave that without getting it wet because I want it to be a hard edge because it's a cast shadow. And over here I'm just going to get it wet so that it can sort of blend around. And make a softer edge right here since it's shadow on the object. It's not cast by anything. Same thing right here. Soften that up. I got a little too much water, so I'm going to use my brush without water and soak it up. So you can see that starting to give it some dimension, making him feel a little more round. Watercolor is kind of a process of that, where you're just building up darks until you're done. So you can see the spots are still showing up underneath there, but not as bad, not as much. And then right here, that's where my water, I wetted it, that's where the water, so it's making a line. Sometimes you don't want that, but in this case I do, since it gives it kind of a cool texture. Okay, to the point again where we need to let it dry before we can add any more details. I could try to keep going on, but things would just start running together. So I'm gonna let it dry, and then we'll do one more step, and then we'll be finished. Okay, that step is all dry now, and I'm gonna go ahead and just do a couple more things for the sake of the video. To not make it too long, we'll stop after this, but you can keep going and adding details as long as you feel like you want to. Just make sure to let things dry in between and make sure to save the light parts of your painting. I'm going to go ahead and do the shadows on the eyes right here. There's sun shining and casting a shadow down onto his eyeballs. And we're going to do some cast shadows on his big tummy scales. Same with here. Put some extra dark in the ears. Well, just this one. That shadow. So every time I do that right here, it's going to make some funky lines. If you don't want the funky lines, you have to basically do a whole wash again to get it all the way over. Or paint with drier paint. Just depends on what effects you want to do. You have to play around with the watercolor more. And then since our light is coming from over here, I'm going to do some cast shadows that these spikes are casting onto his head right there. So this is all dry. I'm not going to get it wet. I just have my dry paint. Make those shadows. Follow the contour of his head. Can kind of blend in over here. Okay, so I'm going to call that finished. If I was doing this for a real painting or illustration, I would spend a lot more time building up the darks and getting the details in where we wanted them. But hopefully that'll give you a good idea of where to go from here. You can always add details in the wings as well, with adding bones and shadows and texture if you want more texture, things like that. But there's our dragon. I hope you had fun watching this and that you go paint stuff. So there you go. See ya.